Hi, I'm Kylie, and this is Just Another Army Vet 2.0, which is all about India. Today is my part 2 reaction to the BeerBiceps podcast, Abhijit Chavda, America's Dark Truth Hidden from the World Population, the Ranveer Show. Let's get to it.
I have to ask you about Afghanistan, Iraq, and even Syria. Do you think that there's anything that ties these three countries together? Ooh, dangerous question. Well, your news media is not going to tell you these things.
Well, Iraq was about the unfinished business of the First Gulf War. Iraq is an oil-rich place. So is Kuwait. Now, Kuwait was liberated in 1991-92, thereabouts. Iraq was still under Saddam Hussein. So the son wanted to finish what his father could not finish. George W. Bush,
It's like a family thing.
It looks like it was a family thing. So George Bush, the junior, wanted to finish what his dad could not finish.
Many Americans do believe that President George W. Bush was just following in his father's footsteps and finishing a job that his father couldn't complete.
His dad defeated the Iraqis, but he could not oust Saddam Hussein. So 2003 was the new invasion, and eventually Saddam was captured the next year and he was executed the year after that. And the Americans got full control of Iraq. They brought democracy into the country. They bombed democracy into the people and they exploited all the oil riches and all that.
Yeah, I don't think the atrocities of the Iraq war are spoken about by American news media. I remember as a kid, my grandparents would watch a lot of CNN and BBC, and it was a very unilateral narrative. War on terror, war on terrorism, Saddam this, terrorists here. It would always portray the opponent in a very negative light. And even as a kid, I used to question the nature of war, that no human being can be completely evil or completely good. There's got to be grey on both sides. I want to ask you about the grey on the side of Iraq, on the side of Afghanistan, and on the side of Syria. And in fact, I want to ask you about the grey or the good on the side of all these countries that were supposedly ruled by dictators, like Libya, like Egypt, all these dictatorial stories that we hear in the recent past. What's the truth? America has been involved directly or indirectly with all these countries. Let's give our American viewers some sort of an objective, neutral narrative.
So when it comes to dictatorships, there is political stability as long as the dictator is in power, properly in power. He's got an iron grip on the country. That can go on for decades if you have the right person in power. And that is great if you want a client state. If you have a country that's rich in resources, let's say full of oil, then you would want a monarchy to be there, a dynasty. So even when the dad dies, his son will come to power and continue the same policies. Or you may want to have a dictator like Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi or whoever else, or what's his name? Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, for instance. So such people are great if you want that country as a client state. That gives you long-term political stability. Democracy is messy. You never know what's going to happen in the next election cycle. Somebody may come to power who's against you. In that case, you cannot continue the same relationship you had with them earlier. That's why the US has always invested in tyrants. And Henry Kissinger, the former Secretary of State during Nixon's time, infamously said that he may be a son of a bitch, referring to somebody, but he's our son of a bitch. He's our son of a bitch. That's why we must support him. We must never say anything bad about him. I don't remember whom he was referring to, but clearly one of those tin-pot dictators that the US props up from time to time. Chile is another example. Argentina is another example. Dictators everywhere. And the US, it's good for the US if you have dictators like that. So they talk about democracy and they preach democracy, but they prop up dictators. That's been their track record over the past 50, 60 years.
It's like having a goon if you're the godfather.
Yeah.
Goon to do your job, goon to give you the extortion money that he's taken off of his country people.
So typically what you do is you install a dictator in power. You give them certain wonderful perks and benefits that as an individual, you would treasure. But in exchange for that, they have to sell their soul. They have to sell their country's resources to the US. That's what happened in Iraq. That's what happened. In the case of Egypt, it was the Suez Canal, which was vitally important as a geopolitical choke point, and various other places in Africa. Some places you had uranium, like Patrice Lumumba was killed off and some other dictator was put in place for uranium. In other places, it's diamond. Some places, it's gold. It's always resources. It's always control. That's what goes on. That's a play.
I got to speak to the scientist in you here. You're someone who does study our planet as well. Have we kind of maxed out our search for resources, or do you think there's still a lot of resources to be found?
I think there is still a lot more to be found. For instance, we are in the age of electric vehicles. And every single battery that you have in your cell phone, in your electric car, electric vehicle or whatever, it's a lithium-ion battery. Correct? Now, lithium is something that's quite abundantly available, but it's very messy to extract out of the earth. So it causes a lot of environmental damage. Now there's a new technology coming up. It's called sodium-ion batteries. Sodium is also plentifully available, but you don't need to mine it. You just go to the sea and pull it out of the sea. Salt, sodium chloride. So there's new technology always coming up, and there's more to extract. There's so many more resources in the planet that we are not aware of yet. There are still to be found. So there's a lot more exploration that's going to happen. There could be lots of major oil and gas reserves that we in India have not discovered yet. It's very much possible. So there's a whole lot that still is going to happen in this planet.
Okay. And depending on the times that we live in, the technology that's at the forefront, do the top geopolitical powers change their agenda, or the countries that they're targeting to either economically colonize / go to war with? Is that a massive angle for going to war, according to you?
Yes, typically you would want to achieve that without any messy war. But if that doesn't work, you can always engineer a war somewhere, a conflict somewhere. So there's always a geopolitical angle. There's always a resource angle. Sometimes it's oil, sometimes it's diamond, sometimes it's gold, sometimes it's uranium, sometimes it's something else. Sometimes it's that your enemy is encroaching there and I want to mess up the place so that the enemy doesn't get control over the place, like in Syria.
Yeah.
So Syria was a very nice, wonderful, peaceful place. Assad was ruling it as a dictator. Well, there are dictators everywhere. Why target this one specific dictator? Because he's not democratic. There are so many other dictatorships that the US is perfectly happy with. What about Saudi Arabia? Isn't that the biggest hereditary dictatorship, one of the biggest ones on our planet? They are fine with that. But Assad is somehow bad. And they tried to overthrow him, but Vladimir Putin intervened. And he was able to stabilize the country. And lots of so-called rebel groups were fighting against Assad, including Al-Qaeda, including ISIS. Aren't these extraordinarily evil organizations that the US was after at some point in time? How come now they are fighting against Assad and Putin and on the side of the US? Isn't that kind of strange? That's the kind of game that's always been played.
What's happening in Syria right now?
Syria spiraled into conflict about 12 or so years ago, 2009, 10, 11. Around that period of time, we started hearing the reports of a civil war in Syria. And the objective was to topple the Assad regime and to put something else in place. And now there was a period of deep instability, fighting everywhere, even Damascus, near Damascus, Aleppo, half the country was in ruins. There were buildings destroyed everywhere, cities, towns, villages destroyed, flattened by bombardments. And they would never show a single picture of a dead body there. Just imagine how many people died there. And that's what was happening. Then Russia got involved because Russia has this strategic port that they are utilizing there. It's called Latakia port, Latakia, something like that. It's on the eastern Mediterranean coast of Syria. So yeah, the Russians have a geopolitical investment in this place, and they wanted Assad to stay in power because even the Russians learned that game, and they also played this game of installing dictators in various places, right? So the Americans failed in Syria. They failed in dislodging Hafez al-Assad. And the Russians have been able to prevail, and Assad is now reasonably secure in Syria. So that's something that's been played out over the past decade or so. There's another messy, terrible war happening in Yemen. Now, nobody hears about Yemen. Yemen is our neighborhood here in India. You go west of India, you reach Yemen. There are lots of these Shia, etc. people in India who have ties with Yemen. Family ties, blood ties with Yemen. It's a very small percentage of India's population. The Shia, the Shia, a certain flavor of Shia people. That's how I would put it. So Yemen is part of our neighborhood. If you look at the Yemeni people, they look like Indians because there is an old history there.
Yeah.
So
I also want to mention that because even you and me are from the English speaking world, our thinking language is English. It's not even Hindi. It's just how we have been brought up as urban Indians. The rest of the English speaking world is also heavily influenced by Western news media. Therefore, we are probably, as the English-speaking world, this is all of Africa, all of America, all of Europe, or most of Europe, has been fed with narratives driven by NATO. Very likely. Am I right? What do
Yes, it's true.
That's why we don't hear of the Russian side of things.
You don't hear the Russian side, and even the German side or the French side is typically leaning in that direction because it's part of the EU, it's part of NATO, so they therefore speak a certain language. The most prominent voices are Fox News, BBC, CNN. These are the heavyweights, and that's typically what you hear. So that's all monochromatic, unidirectional news.
Yeah. Let's talk about Yemen. What's up there? What's happening?
So Yemen is a country that's been pummeled into dust. It's being done by the Saudis, but we know who the Saudis are and who actually owns the Saudis. So there's a whole story behind that goes back 300, 500 years. But what's happening is that this conflict has been brewing since the 1980s, 1990s, and they are trying to destroy the entire nation of Yemen. And there's a lot of resources to be exploited there.
Oh, okay.
It's always about resources. It's a god-forsaken badlands. It's hills and desert and all that, mountainous country and all that. But there's a lot of resources there, and that's what they're after. So the civilians, they've been bleeding for like the past 2-3 decades and probably even longer. The British were involved before this. The British have been no saints either. So there are all these conflicts happening, and when it comes to these conflicts, nobody will report about it. So nobody knows this is happening. And the worst kind of human rights abuses are happening there. There's something called a double tap strike. What you do, you have a funeral. Somebody died in warfare. A prominent person dies. So then the person has to be buried. When a prominent person dies, lots of dignitaries come to attend the funeral. What you do is when there's a big crowd indulge in burying the person, you shoot a missile there from your Air Force, from your drone. Big bang, lots of, maybe 200 people die. Then you wait for 20 minutes. Let the ambulances come in, let other people come in to try and rescue those people. Then you do a second strike there.
To kill even more people possible.
That's called a double tap strike. Who patented this technique? It was the US that did that. And that's what they did in Yemen. There's a book by Professor Isa Bloomy in which he has written about this. So there's a whole lot of atrocities that have been swept under the carpet. So it is disingenuous for the US to call itself the guardian of democracy and peace and justice and human rights and liberalism and all that. Their track record is the exact opposite of that, unfortunately.
This is no different from terrorism.
I would not disagree with that.
How would you remember George W. Bush's tenure? It was about the Iraq War?
The Iraq War primarily.
Okay.
That's what it was. The total destruction of Iraq. More than 1 million civilians died in that. That's not a small number, 10 lakhs. Million innocent civilians.
Would you say he has blood on his hands?
I would not disagree if somebody would say he has blood on his hands.
So yes, hundreds of thousands or upward of 1 million civilians were killed due to coalition forces or American forces, but it's important to understand that it was not just coalition forces doing this. Al-Qaeda had a huge role in killing innocent civilians also. I still remember the night when I was on guard duty while deployed to Iraq at the hospital in Baghdad when there was a mass cow because Al-Qaeda had bombed an orphanage. That is something I will never forget.
Because at the end of the day, the buck stops with the president.
Does Obama have blood on his hands?
More than Bush.
More than Bush?
More than Bush.
Let's talk about Obama.
If you talk about total tonnage, the total amount of ammunition that was dropped on innocent civilians, you add up the totals for George W. Bush, you add up the totals for Obama, Obama comes up on top. And he was given the Nobel Peace Prize the moment he was elected president, even before he had done a single thing. And then he proceeded to bomb the hell out of civilians. He dropped more bombs than George W. Bush ever did. So that is Obama in a nutshell. That's all he achieved. He was a great talker, very smooth orator, big words. But what else did he achieve? I wonder.
Let's break down the Obama tenure a little bit more, especially for Gen Z viewers. Because most people in general know historic figures or world leaders because of the brands that they have projected about themselves. But pound for pound, let's speak about Obama.
So Obama, one of his major characteristics is his ethnicity. The first black male president of the US. The second claim to fame is that he had a female Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, whom he defeated in the primaries when he was fighting to be the candidate, the Democratic candidate for president for the presidential election in 2008. And he eventually was able to. He ended up beating what's his name, John McCain, in the final election. Right. So his first major claim to fame is his skin color. The first ever black president. The second thing he achieved was, it was under his leadership that Osama was taken out.
Apparently,
right. Thirdly,
Apparently?
he presided over the destruction of Libya and the ouster of Muammar Gaddafi, the killing of Muammar Gaddafi. Apart from that, I wonder, he was one of the first presidents known to have ordered the assassination of a US citizen on foreign territory, Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen, and his teenage son as well later on. So a US president who ordered the assassination of a US citizen on foreign territory. And apart from that, I wonder what else he achieved. 2008 to 2016, very well-spoken guy, very suave, very smooth, great orator, but I don't really know what other achievements he can boast of apart from these things.
What was his impression in domestic circles in America?
I think people were really enthused about the fact that finally they'd broken the glass ceiling, that black men could never aspire to become president. So he smashed through that. He was the first president to actually use social media to his advantage and outmaneuver the opponent in a presidential election campaign via social media. Very young guy. He was in his early 40s or so, mid 40s when he became president. So he had new ideas. He leveraged all the latest tools, social media, which nobody else understood at the time. So these are the things that he's remembered for. He's remembered for being a great speaker and that sort of thing. A guy who was a president and used to smoke once in a while. Some of these little characteristics, I personally myself cannot think of any other achievement of his apart from these things.
In my memory of my life, he's probably the most loved American president all over the world. As in, even Indians were rooting so much for him. I remember when he was the day he was being announced as president. What's it called? It's called something.
Inauguration?
What is it called?
Whatever they call it when they
Inauguration day?
Yeah, inauguration.
Yeah.
So when he was being inaugurated, Indians were celebrating. I was like, this is where we lose the plot often as Indians. Barely know what's happening in our own country, but kind of just go ahead with white hype.
Yeah.
Wherever the white man celebrates, we go and celebrate. Speaking about the white man and black men and women and minorities, I want to speak about that aspect of American culture. I don't even know where to begin this. Again, it's a sensitive topic.
There's a whole lot to unpack here.
I've traveled the world and I've met people from all ethnicities. I've met beautiful human beings from all over the world. Whenever I meet African Americans and if I ask them about their country and about the racism that even we face as brown people when we travel abroad, there is a slight discomfort I sense from them. And of course, that's generational discomfort because of what black people were put through 200 years ago, 300 years ago, when slavery was a thing in America, in that phase of America. Definitely embers of that still exist.
They do.
The Denzel Washington movie, Remember the Titans, it's a great portrayal of what I believe 1960s America was, where racism was still very, very prevalent. I am sure it's still prevalent. We hear of our brown friends in America facing aspects of racism, especially when they move away from the coasts. When you go inside the country, they say it's like another country. There's one kind of country on the two coasts, and then there's another kind of country in the middle. I've also faced some racism in America. So it's not that the racism is dead. But what I'm getting to after all this is the plight of the average black person, which I've learned from following American culture, movies, sports. It is a very difficult game of life if you are a black person not born into some sort of financial privilege. And why?
Racism is definitely not dead in the US, not at all. Just think about George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, and let's not forget the fact that since COVID came out in March of 2020, attacks on Asian Americans have grown exponentially. And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
White privilege is a thing. Where since generations, the average white person has had a lot more money, a lot more power, a lot more say in society. Even voting rights, since the longest time, especially white men. Some people even say things like America is low-key one of the most sexist countries. I don't know how true that is. I'm not a woman. I may not ever be able to understand that angle. But I have observed this about the average African American. What some of my friends have told me is that for an African American to rise up from a place of lesser financial privilege, they have to be incredibly street smart, incredibly hardworking. The beauty of America is that if you get them the results, opportunity will be provided to you and a ladder to grow will be provided. But here's the thing about privilege or a lack of privilege. If you don't have privilege in your life, if you're not born into privilege, you're already at a huge disadvantage. Because what is privilege? It's money, being born into money. That money pays for a good education, a good college degree. You're learning a lot of intangibles through that good education, through that college degree. You're learning sales skills, you're learning people skills. What about someone who's as intelligent as you? Maybe your IQ levels match, but because they're not born into privilege, they don't get access to those sales skills, to those people skills. Even if they were as intelligent as you pound for pound, if they had the exact same neural patterns as you. So white privilege is a thing. Racism that black people face in America is a thing. I'd like to know what you think. And my actual question to you is going to be a brutal question, but it's been a while since America got independence. It's been a while even since Martin Luther King Jr., rest in peace. But why do black people still face that level of racism in America today?
They sure do. There's something called racial profiling. If you're a black person, you're way more likely to be stopped by a cop if you're driving a car.
Yeah.
You're way more likely to be shot by a cop for no reason whatsoever. The racial profiling is very much a thing. These days, there is a lot of talk about this, so it may have come down, but the incidents still occur. And that's why Black Lives Matter became a thing. Now, if you want to understand the root cause of this, let's go back to the US independence, the War of Independence. George Washington won it. They ousted the British, the Redcoats. There was the Declaration of Independence, and then you had the Constitution of the US, which was drafted, which says that we, whatever it says, we the people, we believe that all men are born equal, blah, blah, blah. And then this Constitution was ratified by the citizens of the US, which means the Constitution was put to a vote. Do you accept this Constitution or not? And it was, the result was yes. Now, who voted for this? Who was allowed to vote?
White men.
Only white men, and not just all white men, landowners. So a small fraction of the population was allowed to vote whether they want the Constitution or they reject it. Women had no vote. Landless white men had no vote. Black people had no vote. The true natives of America had no vote. Do you think this is a democratically instituted constitution? This is an illegitimate constitution. This is the very root cause of everything. And in the Declaration of Independence, they call they portray the Indians as savages. They call them Indians, the savage, brutal, or whatever Indian. I don't remember what the term is. It's a very derogatory term that they have used for the natives of the Americas in the Declaration of Independence. So the very foundation, the very root of the country is steeped in exclusivism and racism and sexism. And that's the root of the country. The whole nation was born out of that.
And possibly homophobia?
There was no mention of homosexuals at the time, but I'm sure, well, it's a Christian nation. Christianity brings with itself homophobia.
I've not personally experienced a lot of sexism in my life. However, it does exist in the US. I do know that when it comes to pay scales for the same exact job in the workforce, men will get paid about 15-20% more than their female counterparts, even if they meet the same qualifications.
Part of Christianity, whether you like it or not, just read the books, the holy texts. So the entire nation was built on the backs of the labor, the slave labor of the African American men, women, and children. It was also built on the genocide of the Native Americans. That is the truth of the nation. The entire economy for the first couple of 100 years was built on the back of slave labor. It was built out of stolen land that had been stolen from the true owners of the land. right? Eventually, you had industrialization and all. But even then, until the beginning of the 20th century, black people, men, women, children were sold along with animals, livestock, goats, bulls, cows. That's how they were sold, like animals. Families would be broken up. There used to be men who were used for breeding women to produce lots of black children as slaves. And then those families would be broken up as soon as the child is a few years old, sold somewhere else. Imagine how horrifically wrenching it will be for a small child to be uprooted from your mother and father and sold away somewhere as if you're a dog or a cat. So that's the kind of societal background, cultural background, historical background this country has. And then there was the segregation. Even after slavery was abolished, there was a whole civil war for that. The North wanted slavery to be abolished. The South still wanted slavery because they depended on the slave labor for their economy. The North was more industrialized, that they did not want it. They went to war for that. The South seceded. Whole story there. That's a different topic. But eventually the North won. Slavery was abolished, and yet they got no real rights. The blacks were still segregated. They were still second-class citizens until the 1960s. John F. Kennedy abolished that, and he gave people equal rights. But even then, there was a lot of racism for the longest time. Even now, the blacks in some ways are still not quite as equal as everybody else.
I just want to put a disclaimer here. If there are black people watching this, African Americans, or from wherever in the world you are, understand we're talking about this from as empathetic a standpoint as is possible. Trust me, even Indians face an insane amount of racism all over the world. There's nothing compared to the kind of racism that African Americans and their ancestors have faced. But we do come from a place of empathy. Anyway, let's go on. Sir.
Now the problem is this. The United States has a mixed population now. Everybody has some black ancestry. All African American people have some white ancestry. The question is, whom do you hate now? If you want to hate the ones who oppressed you, but you have some of that in you, that's the crossroads the American society has come to. There is no pure black person or pure white person in the US. Everybody is to some extent mixed. Even the purest white person with blue eyes and blonde hair may have 4, 5, 7% black ancestry. Even the person with the darkest skin may have 5 or 6% white European ancestry. So today it's a mixed population. So the question is, whom do you hate now? I think it's a collective guilt for all of them now. There used to be this racist rule in the US called the one drop rule. If a person has even a single drop of black blood, that person is considered to be black. That is a ridiculous, illogical rule. Today, the fact is that it's a mixed society. There is no pure white person, pure black person. Everybody has some European blood, some African American blood, maybe some native blood also. The natives are the most marginalized of the lot. They are completely invisible. They are even below. They are the bottom of the social ladder. So even today, there are massive problems in the US. There is terrible inequality. Just even if you talk about the wealth inequality, it's massive. But even if you look at the racism and the social classes that exist, there is so much angst. There is so much anger about what's happened. About the blacks are still facing all these problems, and the natives are not even spoken about. But certain classes are more privileged now. Now there is this concept of white guilt, that if you're white, you need to be apologetic for that. And now there's all kinds of other weirdness that's come into American society with the rise of what they call wokeism or whatever. So it's a society at a crossroads. It's a society that is dangerously armed. Everybody has weapons. There are more weapons, automatic weapons, guns than human beings in the US today. It's a tinderbox.
He might be a little confused. I don't think it's automatic weapons like M4s or AR-17 style rifles. I think what he's meaning to say is that there's more guns than people in the US. Guns being pistols, rifles, shotguns, etc.
Could go off anytime. And there's shootings happening every day. And I don't know what the causes are, but it's a very damaged society. There's a lot of mental illness in the US. There's a lot of bullying in the schools.
Yes.
All kinds of problems. So that's where we are in the US today. I wish them healing. I wish them happiness. All races, all ethnicities, black people, white people, especially the native people who are still marginalized, who nobody wants to speak about. there's a lot of introspection that the Americans have to do. Instead of coming here and lecturing Indians and other people about how we should live our lives, they need to introspect and try to fix their society. Because that is one of the most diseased societies I've seen in the longest time.
I'm going to speak about something I've not spoken about on the podcast yet, which was Veer Das's poem, which he performed in the US, and there was a big controversy around it. I actually wish to host Veer Das on the show whenever I can. I do look up to him as an artist, as a stand-up comic, as a writer. But I'm not completely in agreement with what he did, because he portrayed a dark aspect of India out there on a public forum in America. I think it was called Two Indias, where he spoke about one great aspect of it, about the culture and spiritualism. And then he backed it up with like the Islamophobia and all that the world knows India as today. Every single country in today's day and age is a mixed bag. That's what's crucial. We're not saying that India is better than America, or America's not as good as other countries and all that. But the truth is that we live in an age where every single country is a mixed bag. Every single country has its own problems. This particular we'll probably address. Would you like to say anything about those?
Absolutely. So I would like to say something that most people won't like. Many people won't like. I call him a brown coolie. It's not a very flattering thing to say. There are certain people who, in order to curry favor in the West, specialize in what some would say shitting on their own people. You know, you go outside your country and you denigrate your own culture, your own people, and you try to amplify the overall impression that the people in that country have about India. So if you look at the overall depiction of India in the Western media, in the US media, whether it's the Washington Post, whether it's the New York Times, they always try to denigrate India. When India did this world record of 103 satellite launches in one rocket, they put up this cartoon of India trying to enter the elite space club with a cow. Right? So they always try to put this colonial backward image of India. And that's how they would like to see India. It's a very Hindu-phobic image of India. India is a backward country with a primitive, barbaric, pagan culture where you have whatever phobia, and women are downtrodden and minorities are downtrodden. These are all lies. I disagree with this completely. And Veer Das, in order to become famous there, went there and made all these statements on a public stage, which I think is shameful. He should be ashamed of himself.
I want to quote Joe Rogan as well. Joe Rogan constantly talks about the media world in America being entirely governed by the left wing. And for the record, I feel I'm personally centrist. I'm not on either side. That's just my political opinion from a overall, even international perspective. I feel, why should there even be two wings? There's probably a little bit of good on both sides. But Joe Rogan himself has said that most of the media world, Hollywood, the television industry is very kind of tends to left in America.
Especially
most
California.
of it, other than I think Fox News, which is leaning towards right. And in Hollywood circles, in acting circles, in these kind of circles, basically the media world of America, you have to say the politically correct things, which in that particular circle is stuff that would please the left wing.
Yes.
And maybe this is an echo of that same...
Maybe. He just wants to succeed there. I mean, he's an outsider. He wants to become one of the inner circle. And to do that, you have to please them, whoever is in power. You cannot say things they won't like. Otherwise, you will get no visibility whatsoever. And you will be out. To get in, you have to play the game. And you have to act the part. And so he's willing to do that. He's fine to do that. I mean, whatever, for good or bad, he's doing it. He's succeeding. He's getting invited for podcasts. I'm sure that he's a reasonably well sought after comedian. I don't find any of his comedy funny. Comedy is funny when you're not making fun of a certain class of people or a certain group of people. When you're making fun of human nature, that's when you're funny. I understand what comedy is, what humor is. When you make fun of yourself, that's funny. When you make fun of human nature as a whole, that's funny. When you make fun of a certain political segment of society, it's not funny. It's unfunny. So I don't...
He has a point, but there's some shows like South Park or The Simpsons, Family Guy that pretty much makes fun of everyone, and that is funny.
Understand this political humor. When you're just trying to appease one certain political class of people, that is not funny whatsoever. That's politics. You're just pandering to politics when you do that. And that's what Veer Das is doing. I don't think he's a talented comedian. I think I don't have a high regard for him. Others may disagree. That's fine. It's my personal opinion.
I actually want to invite Veer Das on the show.
You should go ahead and do that.
Yeah, like
hear what he has to say.
Yeah, I want to know what his perspective was, honestly. Like, no matter how much we know about this situation, maybe he has his own side of the story. I believe he hadn't entirely grown up in India. So maybe the picture he has of India as a culture is kind of driven from the narrative he got growing up.
Neither did I grow up in India fully. I spent part of my formative years outside the country.
How is that? How is it like growing up outside India as an Indian?
You know what? When I was growing up outside of India, in Europe, in Switzerland, I was, to be honest, ashamed of being Indian. India had a very, very negative portrayal in Europe. India was regarded as a place of incredible poverty, incredible backwardness, backward culture, primitive culture, misogyny, backward religion. Hinduism is dirty and it's all that sort of thing. So I never spoke about being Indian, about my culture or anything. I was kind of ashamed of being associated with India. That's how I grew up for a few years. It's only after I came back to India and I traveled to other places, I got a more 360-degree worldview. And then when I started studying and researching history and all of that, that's when I started understanding what India really is. And that's when I slowly began to realize all these portrayals are lies and distortions, and they have a certain agenda behind them.
This is what I feel about most of the left wing in our country, that they've not traveled in the interiors as much.
I haven't traveled in the interiors of India. I've traveled outside of India. I have not explored India anywhere as much as I would want to. But I have explored India through writings, through my scholarly activities, through years and hundreds and thousands of years of study and researching history. Not just Indian history, but world history. That kind of puts you in the perspective of the entire world and what happened there. When you see the effect of colonialism with other countries, in Africa, in South America, in North America, even the effect of colonialism itself in Europe itself, because the true culture of Europe has been wiped out, which nobody realizes. So once you start to see all of that, then you realize what the patterns are and you start to understand what the distortions are. Because the same assault that was done on Europe's pre-Christian culture happened later on in India. The same tactics, the same brutality, the same attempt to portray the Indian culture as primitive and barbaric. It has to be replaced by something superior. So once you study all that, you get a better understanding of things. So even though I spent some of my formative years abroad, I now have a different idea of how things are based on actual data.
So I'm right with Ranveer on the whole being centered politically. I'm not left or right. I'm just kind of right there in the middle. In terms of what Mr. Chavda was saying in regards to expanding his worldview, yes, traveling expands people's worldview, which is why traveling is so important. If you do want to catch my part 3 and final reaction to this podcast, then please hit that subscribe button. Once I film it, I'm going to put it right here. Until then, thanks for watching and please smash that like button.